Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. Have a fun one today. As previously promised, we're going to be putting a full MHR Overrange transmission kit in our shop zip behind me. Now, if you've been following along with the build on this bike, you'd probably remember that a couple of months ago, we did put an MHR Variator in the front of the transmission. Now, the MHR Variator that we used is the front part or about half of the Overrange transmission kit. And at the time we made that video, we did promise that we would do the rear pulley as well. So for today's video though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the bike back to completely stock in the transmission, obviously with still tuned rollers so it'll run properly, but we're going to put it back to how it was before we put the Overrange Variator in it. I'm going to take it for a test ride. I'm going to see what the acceleration and top speed is like. I'm going to come back, I'm going to install the full Overrange kit, and then we're going to take it back out so we can get a good comparison point from the stock transmission versus the full Overrange transmission. Well, we get a good idea of what actual difference the full transmission makes so that, you know, say for your scooter at home, you can make up your mind as to whether this upgrade is worth the money and the effort for you. Now, another important factor here is this kit, obviously being MHR, is designed for a full racing setup. Now, the difference between a racing setup and say a setup like this, which I'd say probably characterizes a sort of mid to high level street setup. This bike currently has an MHR replica 9-port cylinder kit, and the 𝐂𝐡𝐞𝐜 on it, so it's not a race setup. The big difference between these two is this setup here is not a super high revving setup. Compare that to a racing setup with a Bridgeport cylinder kit and a big fat expansion pipe. That's a really high revving setup. So this transmission kit is designed to allow the bike to rev up really, really high before it starts to sort of drop the gearing on it. So we're gonna have to tune this kit according to the use, which is obviously not a racing setup. So I'm going to show you at the end, once we've got everything in, how to tune a racing transmission to suit a more street oriented bike, because this is really important. If you don't tune it, you're going to be really disappointed because the bike's just going to absolutely scream around and barely move. So we'll get to that one in the end, but for now, let's get this bike out on the road or see what it's doing first, sort of what the acceleration is like, what the top speed is like, and that way we have a good comparison point for the end once she's all installed and tuned up. Quite warm today. Okay, so I've just gotten back from our test ride. I put obviously the factory Variator back in the bike. It's doing about 85 on the dash, which is probably about 75 in real life, because the dashes, as we all know, on scooters like to make you feel good. So now that we've got our baseline, I'm gonna go ahead and unbox our new Overrange transmission so we can get it in the bike and make another comparison afterwards. Okay, so I've got our Overrange transmission here. I'm really excited to get into this one. So obviously got our rear pulley here, a special Kevlar belt for the Overrange kit. And if you watched our last install, you'll probably recognize this one. This is the MHR Variator. So as we mentioned in the last video, you can install the Overrange Variator and still use the factory rear pulley, but you cannot use the Overrange rear pulley with the stock Variator. So obviously also very important is our instructions. We've got all our transmission componentry out of the packets ready to assemble. Now I mentioned the instructions. The instructions that come with this kit are terrible. They're just very, very general transmission installation instructions. The reason that's terrible for this particular kit is this kit's quite different to the factory kit in that the front and rear pulley are both greased, whereas the factory kit, the torque driver is greased, but obviously the Variator very much is not. So the major important part of assembling this is making sure that you put the grease where it's supposed to go and definitely not at all where it's not supposed to go. Molossi have been quite intentional with putting seals on all of the componentry to capture the grease and keep it where it's supposed to be. If the grease were, for instance, to be put in the wrong place or were to escape and get on the faces, on the actual drive surfaces of either the front or the rear pulley, they're going to get onto your belt. It's going to cause the belt to slip and the bike's not going to go anywhere. And particularly with belts, because they're made of a slightly porous rubber, if you get grease on them or oil, they're kind of wrecked forever. You're going to go get a new belt. It's going to be really frustrating. So it's very, very important that you take time and care when assembling the front and rear pulley of the Overrange transmission to make sure that you get grease where it's supposed to go and don't make a bit of a mess of it. So we're going to start off with the rear pulley. Now, for the front and the rear, Molossi actually give you these nice little plastic guides. And the idea of these is for when you're actually installing the componentry, the guide is on there to help guide the seals onto the shaft so you don't damage or invert the seal. So I'm going to go ahead and just inspect this, make sure it's all good, which it is. I'm going to chuck both of our seals on. Quite happy that they're definitely sitting correctly in their seats. So this grease here is actually the grease that comes in the Variator portion of the kit, but it's also the grease that you use in the rear torque driver. So the main thing we're trying to grease here, inside a torque driver, you have 3 pins, which are these pins here that come in the kit. And that's what forces the torque driver to actuate along these little slots. But obviously, as they're sliding between metal, it's very important that they are greased. So, it's going to go ahead and pop a little bit of grease in these slots. As I mentioned, because of the seals, this area is sort of captured in a sense. So, the grease can't escape as long as it is kept between these orange seals. But you don't want to put such a ridiculous amount of grease in there that it ends up making its way out anyway. So you want some on the inside of the actual hole first, and then around the slot, and then up and down the slot after the pin has been inserted. Basically don't want the pin dry and sliding up and down a dry slot inside the torque driver. It's going to cause excess friction and wear this component out quite badly. I'm just going to put a little bit, just generally, around the inside of this. Again, just don't want any dry surfaces in here. Going to slide this on. Just gently working it down. There we go. Okay, so you'll know your torque driver is working properly if it has to rotate in order to actuate, which it's doing. Don't have any excess grease laying around. Now we do have a little bit that's worked its way through the holes into the center, essentially where the shaft goes. That's fine. When we put it on, that grease is going to push its way out and we'll just wipe off the excess, but that's totally fine. So quite happy with that. I'll sit that there for assembly later with the clutch. Then we get to our variator. So as I mentioned, the MHR variator is a greased variator. So on the actual variator shaft, it has this little groove with little holes in it, which is essentially designed to sort of capture the grease. And the holes are there to allow the grease to breathe a little bit because it will get quite hot inside the transmission. And what you don't want happening is heat to build up, pressurizing the grease and forcing it past the seals. So because of the rotation of the variator, the centrifugal forces, the grease isn't going to want to enter, but it will allow the air pressure to change inside there so you don't get a pressure buildup and grease blowing past the seals. I'm going to put some grease on the inside of the variator here where the shaft goes. Pretty much the same deal. You just want a nice even spreading of grease on the inside there. You don't want the grease going past the seals. I'm going to put a very small bead inside this little recess of the shaft here as well. Okay, so when we do this, we're going to go from the back of the variator forward. That way any excess grease left around is going to be on essentially away from the driven face of the variator. We want to keep grease away from the driven face. So we're going to go from the back forward. That way any excess grease that works its way off the shaft is going to be on the back of the variator. So pop it through, obviously using our little guide. So we'll see that grease there. Excess grease has actually been picked up by that guide and is staying well away from our driven face, which is exactly what we want. So when you're doing this, what you don't want to do, like once the shaft is in place, you don't want to push it past either of the seals. So you have a seal on the inside here and a seal on the outside there. Once the shaft is in, it stays in. Don't push it past either seal. You're going to have to use your guide again to make sure that the seal doesn't invert and get damaged. Now, as I mentioned, because this transmission is designed for a race setup, it's designed for a scooter that needs to be allowed to rev up really high to make power. We obviously don't have that set up with this scooter. So the Variator kit comes with 2 sets of rollers, a really, really light set. These are the 3.8 grams, I think. Yep, 3.8 grams. And then a secondary set, I think it's like, yeah, 4.3. So we're going to start off with the 4.3s. I think the 3.8s will be way, way too light. So we'll start off with these. I suspect, highly suspect, that we're going to need to end up putting some heavier rollers in it. But just as a baseline to start with, it's always a good idea just to start off with whatever is in the kit and just test it out. Because you never know, this might run awesome with those rollers. You won't know till we try it. With transmission tuning, as long as you you keep the componentry the way it's designed to function. You know, make sure you're using all 6 rollers, make sure you're using your guides, all this sort of basic stuff. In terms of roller weight, you can't really get it wrong. It's all just essentially trial and error. Okay, that's all ready to go. I think we're ready to sort of attack the bike now. Our first port of call obviously is to get our factory componentry out. One of the great things about these Piaggio Hyper 2 engines is the front and rear nut are exactly the same. So you can't stuff it up. Have our new Overrange torque driver here. As always, going to put a pen mark on there, make sure the nut doesn't move. Okay, put our spacer in the back first, Variator in. Now, notice that this doesn't have a pinion in it. I mentioned it in the previous install video, but one crucial thing that you need to understand about this Overrange kit is your electric start will no longer work. You'll notice that the Overrange outer pulley doesn't have any teeth. Compare that to the factory pulley. These teeth are the engagement teeth for the electric start. So no more electric start, be kickstart only. The kickstart obviously is engaged by this little drive that goes in the center of the outer pulley. So that obviously will still work. Obviously have our directional arrow that way forward. Squeeze it right down in there. Now, I mentioned there'd be a bit of excess grease on the shaft. I'm just going to go ahead and wipe that off. Okay, there we go. So this Kevlar belt is a lot stiffer than the factory belt, so just be aware of that. Want to make sure that our belt's not binding up on our outer pulley. So when we do the nut up, it's definitely metal against metal, and the rubber's not mucking things up. So I'm going to rotate them a little bit, make sure the belts, obviously at the moment the Variator's not engaging the belt, so we're just going to rotate them both until the belt starts to engage. There we go. Now, last things last, as we always recommend with Variator tuning, I'm going to put some pen marks on the outside of the Variator. That way we can see how far out it's getting. And I'm actually going to put it on the torque driver as well. We can check that it also is going all the way out. Now, the major difference with the Overrange transmission compared to the factory transmission that I've not really talked about is the diameters of both have been increased. So it's a larger diameter Variator and a larger diameter rear pulley. Now what this does, when the belt is able, because the Overrange belt's a little bit longer. So because the pulleys are large diameter and the belts are also longer, it allows the belt to get further up into the torque driver at low speed, which is going to give you more low gearing. And then on the other side of it, when the belt goes all the way up into the top of the Variator, being it's a larger diameter, it's going to give you more top speed as well. So, you know, different to a gear up kit where it just gives you more top speed at the sacrifice of some acceleration, this Overrange kit gives you more low speed acceleration, more low speed gearing, as well as more high speed gearing without actually affecting any of the acceleration in between, because your final drive is the same. The difference is that you've essentially, it's like adding an extra low gear and adding an extra high gear as well. Okay, first test ride time. For the first one, I'm just going to take it for a quick nip around the car park. A couple of reasons. With a big install like this, you don't want to find out that something's wrong with it because you ride it on the road and end up underneath the car. That's not good. But the other major reason is, again, with a big upgrade like this, within 20 or 30 meters of riding, you're going to be able to tell whether you're at least in the ballpark. So, you know, I'd hazard a guess and say often with a first test ride, and hazard a guess with this one, it's probably not going to be in the ballpark. So there's no point going out on the road and having to do a big loop around the block to get back to the shop, you know, when it's only struggling to do 20 k's an hour because the transmission's not right. So I'd always recommend with a big install like this, you're doing your first test ride, just take it for a really quick 20 or 30 meter ride in a controlled area where there's no other vehicles, because it's a bit unpredictable when you're installing parts like this as to how the bike's going to react, and you want to do that in a controlled, safe environment. So I'm going to flick it around the car park a couple of times and we should work out pretty quickly how close we are. That's a big difference. We're actually pretty close to being in the ballpark. I'm going to take it out on the road and yeah, we'll see how it actually performs in a bit more open of an environment. Okay, back from first test ride. Actually went really well. I checked the pen marks, the rear pulley, so the torque driver. The pen marks are almost all the way to the edge. With time, the belt will stretch and it will get all the way up there, so I'm not worried about that. In terms of the front pulley, so the Variator, the pen marks are almost all the way to the top. I feel that it's definitely over revving, and it would do well from some heavier rollers. So it's got the 4.3s in there at the moment, which were the heavier of the two sets that Variator came with. So I think I'll go ahead and probably put maybe like a set of 4.8s in there. It's probably a bigger jump than I would usually make, but I've had a fair bit of experience with these types of transmissions and I feel like that would be pretty much on the money. If it's not, I'll probably do a 3 and 3 combo, 3 4.8s and 3 4.3s. But I feel like that 4.8, maybe even a little bit heavier. Maybe I'll go for some 5 grams, I think actually. And then yeah, we can do a bit of a combo if we have to. The transmission is just cooling down a little bit right now. It's really, really proper hot. Probably for this sort of thing is one of those times where one of the Malossi Air Force transmission covers would really come in handy with the big scoop, so they get lots and lots of cooling for the transmission. But that's okay, don't have one this time, so I'm just gonna give it a couple of minutes to sort of air cool down because it's really red hot. So I'll go ahead and probably chuck those 5s in, and then we'll catch up after the next test ride, and I think that's gonna be pretty on the money, but we're gonna find out. So inspecting the pen marks when you're transmission tuning, you'll see this little mark just here, that little black mark, that's the remnants of the pen mark that we put there earlier. So which tells us, you know, the belt's obviously getting all the way to the very edge because it's rubbed that pen mark out all the way to the very edge, which means we're getting our absolute maximum top speed that the transmission is capable of supplying, or our top gearing anyway. Now if we look at the rear pulley, you'll see the little pen mark there. As I mentioned, it's not quite all the way to the edge, but I suspect that this will be because the belt needs some time to wear in, that it will stretch, given a little bit of time and a little bit of use, and it will get all the way out to the edge there once that has happened. Now on that note, I thought this was interesting. So I mentioned earlier that we had previously put an MHR Variator in this bike, and this is that Variator which I took out and put back with the stock for this video. Now you can see on this one, the pen marks, even though it had 5.5 gram rollers in it, so pretty heavy rollers, certainly much heavier than this, hasn't it? Even with those, it wasn't getting all the way to the outside. Now what's the difference? The only difference is in this bike now, it has the rear pulley, the rear Overrange pulley as well, and the longer belt. So this is what we talked about in that previous install, that this will go, the MHR Variator will go really well in one of these bikes, but you're not getting the full benefit from it. And you can so clearly see that with the pen marks. You're missing out, that'd be a couple k's an hour right there on the outside. I know it doesn't seem like it, but you know, obviously the further out you go, the larger the outer diameter is. So the bigger difference it makes. So that's a couple k's an hour right there, and that's purely just from the longer belt and obviously the slightly larger rear pulley. So, you know, you definitely get the best benefit out of this Variator kit with the rear pulley and the belt as well, obviously, the full kit. Okay, so I've finished my tuning of the transmission and I'm really happy with it. The bike goes really great. Honestly, massive improvement. In terms of top speed, we've gained about 5 k's an hour. So we've gone from about 75 k's an hour real life top speed to about 80 in the real life top speed. Obviously the dash isn't particularly accurate, as I mentioned earlier, but we've gained about that 5 k's an hour. Now, that's not really where this transmission shines. The off the mark and mid-range acceleration has drastically increased. Off the mark, the bike is so much more responsive. It's popping monos now with ease. Don't really have to pull the front end, just pops straight up. And particularly around the mid-range, say you come around a corner, you back off, you got to get back on the throttle, the power is just there immediately. Regardless of the speed you're doing, you're straight back onto power. The power delivery is so linear and predictable in the sense that you get a bit of a hit at the start, obviously, as you start to take off. Get to about 15 k's an hour, the acceleration drops off a little bit as you'd expect, but it stays consistent. The pull stays consistent all the way up to that top speed of about 80 k's an hour. So it's getting there so much faster than it was before. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with a setup like this, I would usually expect a little bit more top speed performance. Now, having able to look at the bike, and just because we've sort of done this over a number of months, little bits at a time, there's definitely some improvements that could and we will make to the bike, particularly in the airbox. The snorkel's still in the bike, it's still a factory carb. You know, there's definitely some room for top end improvement there, which will get that top speed up a bit more, because at this point it's hitting a power limit where it's just not wanting to rev any further. So doing some more modifications to the rest of the bike, like de-restricting the airbox and getting a bit more fuel through to suit that, will definitely drastically increase the top speed even again, because the bike's still restricted in the airbox. So that's particularly at those top speeds, you know, there's only so much volume of air and fuel you can get through because it's being restricted. So, you know, yes, the bike's only doing 80 k's an hour, but it still has some restriction in it that we need to address. So that'll probably be the next port of call. Maybe even a carb kit. We'll see sort of how we go in terms of what we're going to, how far we're going to go with this bike, I guess. Now, I spoke before about comparing, you know, doing an Overrange transmission kit to doing a gear up kit if you're looking for top speed. Now, I mentioned the Overrange transmission kit will give you a little bit more top speed, but it'll give you much more low end power as well. Now, you know, obviously if you were just to go buy a Malossi RC1 engine, their version of a full race setup, it has a gear up kit and an Overrange transmission. Now, one of the reasons for this, when you put a gear up kit in a bike like this, changing the diff gears, obviously makes the gears taller, so you get more top speed, but you're losing a little bit of down low power and mid-range power. Now, if this was my bike and I was just looking for top speed, at this point, I would now put a gear up kit in the bike. Because we've gained more low speed gearing, when we put the gear up kit in, it's gonna compensate for that quite a bit. So meaning that, say we didn't do the Overrange transmission, we just put a gear up kit in the bike, we will have gained top speed, but we will have lost quite a bit of down low and mid-range acceleration. Putting the Overrange transmission in there compensates for that, meaning that you lose far less off the mark in mid-range acceleration. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds if top speed is what you're looking for. Overrange transmission and a gear up kit, they compensate for each other and work well together, and it's going to give you the best all-round performance and the best top speed. Now, with this bike, we're not really looking for crazy top speed. We just wanted to see what difference the transmission kit made just on its own. And obviously the low end and mid-range is where it has really shone. But if you were looking for top speed, doing one of these kits with a gear up kit would be absolutely perfect. Thanks for watching, guys. Look, hopefully there was some useful info in there for you. If you have any questions about your scooter or maybe a different model of scooter that you want to do a similar upgrade to, please let us know in the comments. We endeavor to answer every single one. And as per usual, if you want to see more content like this and you don't want to miss out on more of this build series on this scooter, please hit the subscribe button. And if you appreciated this video, hit that like too as well. We really appreciate it, and it definitely helps us out. Anyway, we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.